The history of India, as seen through the kind of stories the literature tells, extends out prior to any historical records we have. The earliest organized society that we know of is that of the Harappans, who had extensive contacts with Mesopotamia during the time that Gilgamesh was being composed in Sumerian. The Harappans had a writing system, but it has not yet been deciphered. They were displaced by the Indo-Aryans, who arrived around 2000 BCE. They established an organized agrarian village society, distinct from the urban society of their industry Harappan predecessors, who had focused on trade. The language of the Indo-Aryans evolved into what eventually became Sanskrit, and is linguistically similar to Greek and Latin. The first written works were hymns and ritual formulas composed in Sanskrit, gathered together in a discourse called the Vedas. Vedic hymns are in verse, given by the gods to visionaries or rishis, called poets, kavis. These texts are not poetry, but rather are ritual formulas or mantras that are sacred revelations and which are explained using specialized commentary, sastras, and rule books or sutras. Hindus believe that everything in the universe is comprised of the Godhead itself. Godhead is the absolute and undifferentiated original matter of the universe, and it divides itself into everything that exists. In the early Vedas, this Godhead is referred to as Purusa, or spirit. In the Upanishads, it is renamed Brahman, which means anthropomorphic god of creation. The soul, spirit, or self, the Atman, that animates every living creature is a piece of the Godhead. The ultimate goal is union with the elemental universal Godhead, but that is only possible if the Atman achieves moksha, or liberation, from its differentiated existence. The Mahabharata, the second Indian epic after the Ramayana, represents a world of powerful monarchies and medium-sized kingdoms from which the older republican ideal was beginning to fade. The evolving world was shaped by Hinduism. Composed a little after the Ramayana, the Mahabharata describes a village society that coexists with a more complex urban world. The land is divided into many sizable dynastic kingdoms on the verge of imperial formations. The four caste groups have separated into five, with the addition of untouchables and foreigners. Unlike the Ramayana, which upholds the ideal of monogamous marriage within caste boundaries, the Mahabharata explores polygamous marriages and reproductive relationships. It also presents more complex views on how action, or karma, can accord with divine law, the Dharma. Many judgments regarding the rightness and wrongness of particular actions are presented as unsolvable or uncertain. The Bhagavad Gita tackles the dilemmas of karma in the most difficult situations. What is a just war? When can the use of armed conflict to resolve a political stalemate be justified? When is it acceptable to engage in violent conflict with loved ones? What is such a victory worth if, in the name of life, wealth, or truth, it destroys what we love? These are questions that cannot be completely and totally resolved. The arguments about the human and the divine, and about social and political organization, launched by the Indo-Aryans toward the end of the second millennium BCE, reached their poetic culmination in the encyclopedic structure of the Mahabharata 1,000 years later. The Bhagavad Gita is considered part of the Mahabharata, but even that is contested. The issue is whether it was originally part of the Mahabharata or not. And you've got to think about whether this is intended as a dramatic narrative or a historical account. Would both armies really have waited while Krishna and Arjuna had this conversation? The Bhagavad Gita is attributed to Krishna Devapayana, but it was composed collaboratively between 400 BCE and 400 CE. It describes the protracted conflict between two branches of a royal dynasty in northern India over the inheritance of a kingdom and the succession to the throne. The two branches are the Kauravas and the Pandavas. The Kauravas make a compromise of sorts, but then refuse to honor the argument. And Krishna, the human avatar, the appearance or manifestation of a divine being on earth, this human avatar of Vishnu, intervenes on behalf of the Pandavas and tries to negotiate a deal with the Kauravas, but they refuse to give in at all. The Pandavas decide the only way to obtain the land that is legitimately theirs is to go to battle, based on the dharma of succession and inheritance. And they think that it's justifiable because they've exhausted every other method. Once battle seemed inevitable, Krishna offered both sides the opportunity to choose between having either his army, called the Narangi Sena, or himself alone, but on the condition that he personally would not raise any weapon. Arjuna, on behalf of the Pandavas, chose to have Krishna on their side, and Duryodhana, the Kauravian prince, chose Krishna's army. At the time of the great battle, Krishna acted as Arjuna's charioteer, since this position did not require the wielding of any weapons. Arjuna, as he watches the two sides align against one another, starts to have second thoughts. I mean, this is his family. He feels like he's stuck in an untenable situation. He feels that he can't fight loved ones, but as a warrior or Kshatriya, Dharma requires that he wage war when the cause is just. And the Bhagavad Gita is the record of this conversation between Arjuna and Krishna. This conversation is the inner frame of the text. The outer frame is a conversation between Dhritarashtra, the father of the Kauravas, and Sanjaya, his charioteer. Sanjaya has celestial visions. He can see the past, present, and future, and narrates what is happening. And we as the readers are witnessing everything, including the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna's, including the conversation between Krishna and Arjuna through Sanjaya's visionary eye. And so the main idea is that violence is only justified when every other possible avenue has been explored and failed. In chapter 1, we see that Arjuna is at first ready and eager for battle. Looking at stanza 21 on page 1285. Then he said these words to Krishna, Lord of the earth, unshaken one, bring my chariot to a halt between the two adverse armies, so I may see these men, arrayed here for the battle they desire, whom I am soon to undertake a warrior's delight in fighting. I see those who have assembled, the warriors prepared to fight, eager to perform in battle for Dhritarashtra's evil son. But then he begins to question whether he should participate in a war with his own family. On stanza 28 on the next page, we're told he felt for them a great compassion as well as a great despair. In stanza 31, he says, I foresee no good resulting from slaughtering my kin in war. He begins to wonder if in killing does one also become evil. Look at stanza 36. For if we killed these murderers, evil like theirs would cling to us. And finally, he questions whether he is creating a family tradition of lawlessness. Let's look at stanzas 44 through 46. This is the bottom of 1287. Men whose familial laws have been obliterated, O Krishna, are damned to dwell eternally in hell, as we have often heard. It grieves me that as we intend to murder our relatives in our greed for pleasures, kingdoms, we are fixed in doing evil. If the sons of Dhritarashtra, armed as they are, should murder me, weaponless and unresisting, I would know greater happiness. So in this stanza 46 here, he's basically saying it's better that I would be killed rather than to kill my own family. In chapter 2, we see Krishna's response to Arjuna's concerns. The text questions whether human action is the result of the fate of the gods or the result of free human choice, which is a question we also saw posed in Oedipus. Arjuna apparently thinks that he has free will because when worrying about the upcoming battle, he indicates that he seeks to preserve the laws of the caste through his actions. He also worries that the wrong choice will lead him to hell. Arjuna trusts that if he makes the correct choice in his actions, he will not suffer this fate. Krishna, however, makes suggestions that might be understood to support a predestined existence, even as he denigrates mourning for those who are dead. Look in chapter 2, stanza 27 on the bottom of page 1289. Death is assured to all those born, and birth assured to all the dead. You should not mourn what is merely inevitable consequence. He even then states that pitiful are those moved by the fruit of action, which implies that Arjuna's worries about taking the right course of action are groundless. In lowering the emphasis on cause and effect, Krishna critiques the idea of free will. Let's look at stanza 11 here in chapter 2. This is the beginning of our selection from chapter 2 on page 1288. Krishna tells Arjuna, although you seem to speak wisely, you have mourned those who are not to be mourned. The wise do not grieve for those gone, or for those who are not yet gone. There was no time when I was not, nor you, nor these lords around us. And there will never be a time henceforth when we shall not exist. The embodied one passes through childhood, youth, and then old age, then attains another body. In this, the wise are undeceived. Krishna is telling Arjuna here there's no need to grieve because of reincarnation and because you are part of me, you are part of the Godhead. You've always been here and you always will be here. The Atman may die, but because we're part of the Brahman, we will always exist. And on page 1290, we've got a couple of stanzas here where we have a discussion of the role of the warrior. Look at stanza 31. Nor should you tremble to perceive your duty as a warrior. For him there is nothing better than a battle that is righteous. Then skipping down to 33. If you turn from righteous warfare, your behavior will be evil, for you will have abandoned both your duty and your honored name. People will speak of your disgrace forever, and an honored man who falls from honor into shame suffers a fate much worse than death. And then again, this is the idea of what one leaves behind, the honor of one's name. That's something that we see the epic heroes constantly concerned with. How am I going to be remembered? What am I going to be leaving behind here? And Krishna's telling him here, focus on that. Think about your duty as a warrior and how you're going to be remembered. Look at stanza 47 further down there on page 1290. Your concern should be with action, never with an action's fruit. These should never motivate you, nor attachment to inaction. So Krishna is telling him to think about what it means to be concerned with action, to not worry about the consequences of the action. And as the reader, we're left to wonder, is that possible? Can you just act and not think about the consequences of the action if you're a thinking and caring person? And so, here the Krishna continues on to discuss how one achieves the higher mind, what is the result of it, how does one respond. Look on page 1291, starting with stanza 50. One disciplined by higher mind, here cast off good and bad actions. Therefore, be yoked to discipline. Discipline is skill in actions. Having left the fruit of action, the wise ones yoked to higher mind are freed from the bonds of rebirth and go where no corruption is. When your higher mind has crossed over the thicket of delusion, you will become disenchanted with what is heard in the Vedas. When unvexed by revelation, your higher mind is motionless and stands fixed in meditation, then you will attain discipline. So here, Krishna is saying to focus on the inner self. Again, remember the self is the Atman. The objections that Arjuna raises in the first chapter stand as an important contrast to this debatable position elaborated by Krishna. The argument of the immortality of the soul and the constant regeneration and reincarnation of those that have died might be understood as a utilitarian argument that justifies war and violence in any situation. In particular, we see here in chapter 2 an explicit argument to ignore the consequences of one's actions, a position some would call irresponsible and others would condemn as philosophically heinous. However, Krishna's argument should not be understood as the sole intended meaning of the text, because Arjuna's objections are thoughtful, serious, and not entirely answered by the chatty god. Arjuna places special emphasis on the importance of family, and in his sensitivity to slaughtering friends and companions, he demonstrates a deeper insight into human beings' nature than Krishna does. Indeed, Arjuna displays particular nobility in his understanding of the purpose of being a king. Arjuna desires to be king for the sake of these others rather than for himself, and so he doesn't understand how killing them will help any. This is an argument Krishna does not answer, perfectly illustrating how many of the questions raised in the Gita are not meant to be completely answerable. In chapter 3, Krishna contrasts the discipline of knowledge with the discipline of action. This idea that inaction is still a form of action, and so the mind must control the action. Look on page 1293, stanza 9, the end of that stanza. Krishna tells him, act without attachment to your deeds. And this goes back to the idea of dharma, that all things must play their parts. Action comes from the Brahman and exists in everything. Further down on page 1293, stanza 15, know that action comes from Brahman, Brahman comes from the eternal, so that all-pervading Brahman is based in sacrifice forever. The Gita proposes a certain understanding of man that culminates in the obliteration of the self, and this conception is necessary for its argument concerning just war. Krishna begins his instruction of Arjuna by removing the worry about killing others, because humans have immortal spirits, and again, he says, death is assured to all those born, and birth is assured to all the dead. If all those who die will be born again, then Krishna suggests that one should not worry about the impending slaughter. This position minimizes the individual because those human connections that an individual values, friends and family, are only important insofar as they assist the individual in right action. Right action properly followed, however, is done without attachment. If you look on stanza 7 of chapter 3, bottom of page 1292, but he whose mind controls his senses, who undertakes the discipline of action by the action organs without attachment, is renowned. This discipline finally ends in a detachment even from friends, family, and in self, an obliteration to the divine self. If we skip over to chapter 6 and look at stanza 18, this is on page 1296. After his thought has been subdued and abides only in the self, free from all longing and desire, then he is said to be steadfast. Part of the complexity of the Gita is due to its use of paradoxical statements to convey its most difficult or perplexing points. This is apparent at several points in the selection that we have in our anthology. For example, at the beginning, in response to Arjuna's objections to fighting the battle, Krishna states that to the wise man, pleasure and pain are one. In any normal human experience, pleasure and pain seem to be opposites rather than a unity, and thus the concept of the wise man, which is one of the central concepts of the text, is introduced through a paradox that points beyond itself. As readers, as for Arjuna, we need further clarification to understand this complex and seemingly contradictory concept. While Krishna does offer it, it only brings further paradoxes. When Krishna describes yoga, for instance, he states that the proper yogi should have his mind sharpened to one point, with thought and senses both subdued and without desire. Yet the yogi must be desiring wisdom and unity with the divine self in order to do yoga. And the final consummation of yoga, having subdued thoughts and senses, is a perception. All of this leads us to wonder, how can a perception be neither in the intellect or in the senses? The Gita's description of the vision of the consummation of yoga and Krishna's revelation of himself in his true splendor to Arjuna in chapter 11 are reminiscent of the vision of God found in other traditions. We get a description of the moment of Krishna's revelation of himself as a unity in chapter 11, stanza 13. This is on page 1299. And then the son of Pandu saw the universe standing as one, divided up in diverse ways, embodied in the God of gods. This unveiling of the true appearance of God is too much for Arjuna, however, and we see him praying on the next page, top of page 1300, stanza 45. I am pleased to have seen what never has been seen before, yet my mind quakes in its terror. Show me, O God, your human form. Have mercy, O Lord of gods, abode of all the cosmos. There are similar descriptions in Greek mythology of Zeus showing his true self, only for the viewer to be consumed by flames as he is overwrought by the vision. Another example is in Dante's Paradiso, where heaven is described as a continuous, radiant, and sublime vision.